It has been discussed for years, and finally we are here. The Tartarus arc has finally happened, as far as an arc can be considered. What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki coming at you with another chapter review on the latest My Hero Academia, chapter 297. As you guys already know, we tend to go page by page in these breakdowns. But this one, I think, was a pretty fast chapter, so I'm not going to say it's going to be a short video, but it should be a lot shorter. So, right off the gate, we immediately launch into a discussion on the way Tartarus has been constructed. It's a sea prison, similar to Impel Down. Very classic thing to be done here, where you put a pit and you stick it out into the middle of the ocean. The fact that it's several kilometers removed from the mainland is another security defense in itself, obviously, to help minimize the odds of anybody escaping off the island, even if they were to break out. If they can just turn off the bridge, if you don't have a quirk that allows you to swim or fly, you're probably going to have a really rough time doing anything of value anyway. But it's heavily discussed that also people tend to never get out. There's a good chance that that's a bit of hyperbole, but in general, because like for example, Ending could have been a person who lived in Tartarus. We don't know that, so I don't know if we're supposed to take that at full face value. But if Ending wasn't a big enough villain to get sent to Tartarus, I guess that also makes sense. It's just a matter of perspective. We know that Gentle was offered a second chance instead of being sent there, so clearly it's about once you get sent there or not that determines. So does seem to be a limit. They even talked about how Gigantomachia should be arriving in the morning. So understand this. When last chapter, when All For One was like, yo, why do they think tomorrow's coming? I'm not letting them rest. And Horikoshi had put up a box that said that night. And we cut over to this chapter, and it's just, I believe, 8:24 p.m.? Let me see. Yeah, 8:34 p.m., sorry, was when everything pops off. And you've got these guards named Gyges and Briareus, and these are all Greek references to the Titan mythos within Greek mythology. You've got Tartarus being named Hell, which is really just kind of like the god. Like one, in some iterations, he's like a god of evil. Two, he's like the deepest pit of hell where the Titans were stored after they were punished. And in this case, Kronos would be All For One escaping. So the thing that I find fascinating is that we get to see that all the robots utilized at Tartarus, literally every single one of these, is in fact the same kind of model of robot that is used at UA, with the only exception is that these clearly have AKs and all kinds of fully automatic machine guns attached to them. So we know for sure now that whoever's providing robots for UA is also providing robots for Tartarus or high security prisons. Regardless, we now know for sure that even though UA does have that front of being the more friendly school and Shiketsu is seen as a military school, both clearly seem to be getting funding from military budgets or bases at the very least. So we now know that these robots are secretly also just military security measures, which you could argue brings up the question of where were these zero-pointer style robots as Gigantomachia was rampaging through the streets. This is something that I think my buddy Ray brought up on Anime Lately. But yeah, that's something to ask yourself, like, if the government has the ability to access these giant robots, why didn't they at least try to send one after Gigantomachia? Maybe it would have had some firepower to stop it. At least he would have had to spend delay. Or who knows, maybe they thought he would just grab one and just chuck it. Or they only keep it on certain bases, and that's Machia didn't actually get in close proximity to any of those. But at that point, if you have the option to have mechs everywhere, why wouldn't you? But I think that just kind of comes down to the military not being a high priority, and this more or less being police measures. But one of the things worth noting is that we meet Seiji Shishikura's dad, which if you don't remember who Seiji is, he's the meat boy from Provisional License who shows up again during Remedial Course arc, and we kind of get to see where he gets that nasty temperament from, because his father is a blatant I hate criminals type person. Basically says most of them don't even count as human, and the only reason why they didn't throw a missile at Gigantomachia is because he's technically still genetically human. Basically very pro just beat him and treat him like dirt. So you get to see now like why the boy is such an extremist, even though like his meat quirk makes him a bit more malleable as far as susceptibility to ideology. And I think it's interesting that this prison guard doesn't realize that he is himself as corrupted by this influence or whatever as he likes to think of the villains as, because he's got such a harsh and extreme view and like basically like. But it's important to note that in Japan there's roughly 80% support of the death penalty, so his views might not necessarily be seen as that extreme, even though he's basically saying I support the violation of human rights, which in of itself brings a bit of hypocrisy and a lack of self-awareness to his comments about how the only reason these villains were able to be, in society for so long is because quirks altered the standard of humanity. Meanwhile, his very humanity should be questioned because of how flippantly he is okay with the idea of just people having their human rights violated and taken from them. We get multiple bots deployed while they're freaking out. All for one, the most important thing about this is that, one, there seems to be a missing near high end. Two, during the raid, you get a close-up on Shigaraki's face, and it seems like while Vestige for one is in control, he is actually blind, because you get the typical whited out eyes while Vestige for one is in control. And then it gets a bit of a coloration to the pupil again as Shigaraki's fighting for control. And the next page is saying that, like he wants his body. And the thing that I find fascinating here is that, once again, you have All for One talking about how Shigaraki is going to be the next him, and that he's not just a pawn, and that he's really important. And you kind of get a callback to the cover, I believe it's like volume 8 or 9, but it's one of the ones during the Forest Training arc where All for One has his hands set, and there's all this wisp coming around, and you got Bakugo and Deku in there, but you also see Shigaraki in the background, and now you see that they're all within the clutches of All for One. That's what that whole cover kind of works as a foreshadowing for. But Vestige for One also acknowledges that breaking into Tartarus, even though we see him do this within one chapter, is not feasible even if he had Gigantomachia with him and been at prime 100% prepared Shigaraki. The thing that I find fascinating about this, though, is that because he has the ability to use the EMP or whatever, he just kind of shoots a charge through the building and starts getting the villains inside out. Now, this is one of the cool things about this that I really liked, is that it's full acknowledgement that, one, the bases, the security that they have there is actually valuable. There is a legitimate reason. If All for One himself is saying that in my prime, with prime physical condition, I cannot break through this facility, then I think that's a good acknowledgement of the quality of how effective all these damages, like robots and turrets and all this other stuff, would be if it weren't for the fact that, Decay and all these other things are pretty powerful quirks. Like, he decays a surveillance tower, but you see his arm is starting to fall apart. The hyper regeneration isn't holding up. So you just got to real quick get as much help from the villains inside as possible, which leads to people like Muscular and Moonfish breaking out. We see, and they're going on murderous rampages. One of the really cool details in this chapter, though, is that even though Muscular gets to just block bullets and he's fine, like, as far as he's not like taking damage and worried about being critically injured, you still see that because those are muscle fibers, because it's still human flesh, all those bullets still go in there. So you get like 30, 40 holes in his arm, and he is actually bleeding from the wounds because those bullets still matter. So it's a cool detail to keep his body consistent with being a bunch of muscle fiber that's raw and exposed, even if he does have a high power output. We get introduced to what seems to be a new fandom waifu, because I've already seen different fan colorings, people thirsting, and she's only been on a couple pages, but I'm really looking forward to her. She seems to have some kind of electromagnetism quirk, or at the very least some kind of energy or aura like comes off her as she's breaking Overhaul out of his cell, because we see the return of Overhaul, who's banging his head against a wall, trying to get out of the prison in order to escape, so he can go save the boss. And I think that's one of the things that I really like, is that consistency, is that while he's been in prison, when he comes out, his first thought isn't his machinations. It's not about the fact that he doesn't have his quirk anymore. He just wants to make sure he can go and get to the boss at some point. And then we get to the final pages where All for One is talking to the rest of the prisoners, and he's like, yo, if it's freedom you want, follow me. He's still carrying Seiji Shishikura's father. And he says something very interesting, which is this impending void era will give rise to a more perfect demon lord. This will be the story of how I become the greatest demon lord of all. And now, the kanji for this apparently also translates to the exact same. This is the story of how I became the greatest hero. And so this is the story of how I became the greatest demon lord. So now it seems like All for One is like, yep, cool. Like, all that stuff I said about Shigaraki being needing to develop as a leader, developing all of his like psychological stuff is being thrown to the wayside. I'm not too sure about this weird, very heavy conflict in character and weirdness to conversations. One of the main things the only thing that I can think of is that this is a combination of what happened during My Villain Academia right now, where Ujiko and Gigantomachia more or less tested him, where Ujiko was like, you were always going to get help from me, but you still needed to tame Gigantomachia to show that it was like worth actually giving it to you and you were ready to get that help. And that you could establish your reputation and be that villain. So I think it's strange that they went out of their way to have him build a social capital, build, his power and all these other things, just for All for One to take his body. So there's a part of me that suspects that this is another final exam where he's, like I said in previous videos, he's going to have to overcome the ego of All for One and the Vestige in order for him to go ahead and finally become that true demon king, because they constantly reference like Shigaraki as like the next king. They're always like, yeah, like this would be perfect for Tomura. This is like to his personality. All these things keep getting said, and now there just seems to be like all of this being walked back. So there has to be something at play here that we're not fully getting. One of the things that I considered while we were on air is that maybe the reason why they say it's all for Shigaraki, the boy Tomura, it's all about Tomura Shigaraki, is that when All for One named Tomura Shigaraki, he actually gave Tomura his actual real name. That's one of the only things that I could think of that would kind of justify it, and it would then make it a form of weird doublespeak, where he's technically referring to the boy as also himself. So him saying, I'll make him the next demon lord is like, yeah, I'm the demon lord. I'll make him into me. We'll be together. It'll be a symbiotic thing, because he directly tells Ujiko, like, hey, if you didn't want it to go down this way, then go get me a new body or fix this one up, because we didn't find hyper regeneration fast enough. So it seems like in such direct contradiction to what has been established multiple times in the story as far as his own body being damaged, to the idea that him asking Ujiko to get him another body implies that he, one, would not be able to take Shigaraki's body anyway, or that he would not be able to actually like body swap. But then it seems like, okay, all of a sudden Shigaraki is a viable candidate for body swap. I don't understand where these contradictions in his dialogue comes from, so I'm really hoping we get some All for One flashbacks where we either get clarity that this is in fact the final exam, the thing necessary. Horikoshi playing it cool with the rule of two from Sith lore and just like letting that Star Wars fan hang out a bit, and not just him kind of forgetting he wrote a bunch of different dialogues within All for One's character. But I'm actually on this one a bit more curious about what other people think, because at this point I feel like I've said multiple things that are kind of like redundant towards this is contradictory towards what he's done in the past. Overall, this chapter was a quick rush. On stream, we managed to like spin a lot of discussions out of it, but overall, what actually happens in this chapter that isn't just me being speculative is pretty quick. It's easy to understand. There's some speculation that maybe the last near high end, he only showed up with 6, and the other one was actually with Dabi and Spinner, because we don't see them and we don't know where Skeptic is. So the 3 of them plus the near high end could possibly be getting into something. We don't know where Toga is still, so we need to figure out what's going on with them. And then lastly, the thing that I find kind of interesting is that now you have the potential, effectively a 4th faction, if you will, because we've had the League of Villains with Shigaraki, Dabi, Spinner, and Toga, where their whole mission could end up turning out to be that they're going to try to do their best to save they're going to do their best to save Shigaraki from the clutches of All for One, So then you'll have like the League of Villains faction now has their own mission involving saving Shigaraki before they get back to the business of taking over the system. Then you can have All For One having built up his own faction with these prisoners. Then you'll have the same like the pro hero camp where we'll be following their plot line, figuring out what's going on with characters like Hawks, Endeavor, Mirko, what they're going to be doing in the direction. And then we'll have the kids whose plot lines we'll have to follow too. We'll definitely get to see where this is going. Let me know what you guys think. This is one of the shorter chapter reviews I got to do. If you enjoyed anything I had to say or enjoyed the discussions, if you are watching this after already watching a stream or going to watch this and thinking about watching the live stream, then just go ahead and subscribe. I intend to do more analysis videos, got some deep dives coming. I've been watching some documentaries for a very important video that may explain in like more detail what's going on with Shigaraki based on a lot of his characterization in past writing. So be on the lookout for that. That's all we got to say. If you're not here for any of those analysis videos and you just want the live stream discussions, then I'll just see you Sunday for the Church of MHA. That's all I got to say. Aniki out.